All right. All right. Welcome to Nature Nerd Night. This is our August special of ecological superheroes.
Yeah, I'm so excited.
Or Keystone Species, if you would prefer.
Either one.
Yeah, we're going to talk all about them tonight. So if you've joined a Nature Nerd Night before, you kind of know how this goes. If you haven't, you're in for a treat, literally a treat. So,
Maybe.
All right.
Let me let one more, and we forgot to say, by the way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yourself. My name is Monica. We always forget to introduce ourselves. So my name is Monica Mccabrie. I am the Wildlife Education Specialist with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.
And I'm Amber Schultz with the Fish and Wildlife Education Division.
All right. Ready?
All right.
If you're a nature-loving science nerd, we think that you just might be happy like us to start Nebraska Nature Nerd Night. Turtles, fish, and vertebrates, disease, and fungi too. You're a curious brainiac, we've got a show for you. All right, it's nerdier every time we do it, but welcome everyone to Nebraska Nature Nerd Night tonight. Like I mentioned, we're talking about Keystone Species tonight, or ecological superheroes, whichever you prefer. They mean kind of the same thing, but we're going to get a little more in depth. If you're not sure what a Keystone Species is or what makes a superhero, we're going to talk about that tonight. So Keystone species are these animals that play a huge role in kind of their web of life. They balance the ecosystem, and oftentimes they're animals that maybe we don't think about being superheroes, or they kind of go unnoticed at times. So, but they're very important for the health of the ecosystem. Three of them we're kind of going to focus on tonight are going to be prairie dogs, bison, and beavers.
So exciting.
Yeah, I'm very
And I know
excited.
it's mammal heavy, so I'm sorry for like the herps and the invert folks out there.
We'll have our thing in October
Absolutely.
when we talk about turtles.
Yeah.
So I'm going to overlook that tonight.
Okay, that's fine.
But yeah.
We have some excellent speakers with us tonight, so I want to make sure that we introduce them, and we're just going to get started. I know you guys are here to listen to our awesome experts and us nerd out. So first of all, we have Chris Helzer. He is a Nebraska Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy. So he spent a lot of time doing some pretty incredible research on grassland in Nebraska, has a wealth of knowledge there. We also have Sarah Nevison. She's our natural legacy wildlife biologist with Nebraska Game and Parks. She's been on this program before. She's always excellent, and she's super fun to nerd out with.
You may have remembered her from our animal love episode.
Yeah, she was kind of a rock star.
It was great.
And then we also have Adam Allers, and Adam is coming to us from Kansas State University. And he is associate professor or a wildlife ecologist. I reached out to somebody at UNL, one of our old professors, and I said, do you know a person who could talk? Do you know a beaver expert? And he's like, Adam is your guy. so he comes to us with some cool accolades. So thanks so much, Chris, Adam, and Sarah, for joining us tonight to talk about ecological superheroes. We're so excited to learn from you and to nerd out with you. To get us started, I want to know from each of you, what made you a nature nerd? How did you get into this field? What kind of brought you to this space? And you can fight over who wants to go first.
I'll go first. It looks like, unless you guys want to take it.
You take it, Adam.
So I'm coming from you guys from Kansas State University, but I'm actually a Nebraska boy. I grew up in Antelope County, Nebraska, along the Elkhorn River. And I would say that my first foray into being a nature nerd was when I was 6 or 7 years old. My parents, Santa, bought me a live raccoon trap. And so I walked around our farm in the prairies and the river every night or every day looking for the best spot to find a raccoon to catch. And so that kind of got me started. I was also, interestingly, one of the first otter release attempts in Nebraska in the 80s happened about a half mile from my house. And so I could walk down to the Elkhorn River while the Nebraska Game and Parks were releasing these otters out of these boxes and watch them. And so that kind of got me hooked. And I spent a number of years harassing Nebraska Game and Parks through snail mail, asking for all sorts of flyers and information they had on cottontail rabbits, on quail, on pheasants, on prairie chickens. And so anyway, 40 some years later, I'm at Kansas State University now.
That's so cool.
That's a good story.
I just wanted to say, sometimes in our division, our fish and wildlife education, we get snail mail from kiddos asking for like the most specific things. Yeah, and I'm telling you right now, we have loads of stuff to do. We're always doing, very busy. We make that a high priority, and we reply because it's like future.
We get him.
Yeah,
so like
absolutely.
We need more of them.
So that's so cool to hear that.
I'll tell you, I would wait, by the mailbox on our country road every single day, waiting for that manila envelope to show up with all those brochures. And I'd ask for the same brochures month after month. And so I'm sure glad that someone actually humored me.
Oh, that's so
awesome.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. Awesome. Chris or Sarah, go for it.
Go ahead, Sarah.
All right.
So I have been on before, so hopefully I've met some of you virtually in the past. For those who I have not met, like Monica and Amber said, I'm a wildlife biologist with the Game and Parks Commission based in Lincoln, Nebraska, but I'm originally from Minnesota. And oddly enough, I wasn't really into the outdoors as a kid. My parents had a cabin and I actually didn't really love going up there. And it wasn't until college when I had to decide kind of what am I going to do? And I always liked animals. So I thought maybe I'll be a vet. And then I was like, no, I do not want to be a veterinarian. And I discovered the field of wildlife biology, that something in me changed. And the fact that I could study animals outside, you know, be outdoors and do science, and that could be a career, I was hooked. So I've always liked science. I've always enjoyed asking questions. I have always liked knowing facts and sharing facts with people. My husband is also a wildlife biologist, so we definitely nerd out together.
It's like a love language.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a love language. We're raising our daughter and we just hope that she likes the outdoors without pushing it on her too much. But I am absolutely a nerd, but I say that proudly. Nerd with an. I like being a nerd.
Absolutely. That's what we're about on this show too. Thank you so much, Sarah. Chris.
Well, I was an outdoors kid for sure. Most of my elementary school age years, I was in Bridgeport, Nebraska, out in the Panhandle, and spent a lot of time riding my bike down to the fishing hole and catching a bunch of little bluegill and exploring for snails in the road ditch across the street from the house. And I was in scouts, mostly just so I could go camping. And later on, I think, in college, I went to college thinking I would be a forest ranger or something along those lines, not really knowing what that meant. And then got introduced to prairies in college and fell in love, I think partly because they were, you know, an underdog and everybody in college is looking for a cause, and that was mine.
I like that.
Nobody else seemed to care much about them among the people I was around. So of course that made me care about them more. And then I think the other big thing for me is becoming a photographer as I started carrying a camera around, especially when I got a macro lens, which basically lets you kind of look at the world through a microscope and take pictures of what you see. That really rocked my world and changed the way that I look at nature, and I pay a lot more attention to small things. And some of you might know Mike Forsberg, who's an incredible conservation photographer. And Mike and I like to laugh at each other because when we walk around, he's looking up at wildlife and landscapes. I'm looking down at insects and flowers. And so we could go to the same place and take pictures and you'd never know we were in the same place.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I like that that's an extra tool for kind of your craft and your field.
Yeah.
And you also have a blog that's very awesome to read, The Prairie Ecologist. If anyone's interested, we can give that link in our evaluation for everybody as well. So.
Yeah, it's really good. A lot of good content.
Yes.
It's like he gets to nerd out about prairies.
Yeah.
It's pretty sweet.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're going to jump into our subject tonight because we're super pumped to talk about ecological superheroes. So I guess just to set the baseline here, how would you describe what is a keystone species? If you're someone who's never taken an ecology course, or you're just like my mom's on the show tonight. I don't know if she knows what a keystone species is, and that's so cool.
How would my mom's on too?
Okay.
And I don't know if she knows either.
Let's talk about it. How would you explain what is a keystone species? Anyone can go. We can fight over this now.
I'll jump in first.
Okay.
Say that it's actually not succinctly defined. You might hear a couple different interpretations of exactly what a keystone species is. Basically, it's a species that has a really large effect on an ecosystem. Sometimes without that species, that ecosystem either might not exist or it might not really be the same. So I'll just say that as my little tidbit and see kind of how Adam and Chris would define it.
I think that's a good start, Sarah. That's a really good definition. I think maybe it's important to look at like one of the better examples of keystone species, which would be sea otters and urchins and kelp forests, right? And so where sea otters is, we consider a keystone species where they were over harvested or extirpated out of the Pacific Ocean, or a lot of the areas of the Pacific Ocean. And because of that, urchin populations, which are, you know, key prey for otters, exploded. And they ate all the kelp. right? And so there were no kelp forests because there were no otters. And so by removing that one species, it just put the whole ecosystem in disarray, right? And so they have this really, like Sarah was saying, this really huge effect for their own body size for an entire ecosystem.
Like a cascading effect, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. And it can be hard to decide if it's a keystone species or just a really important species. And then I think there's a lot of keystone species we probably just don't know about yet, especially in the invertebrate world, since you mentioned invertebrates. I mean, I would guess that some of our bigger, more important predators, like spiders, for example, in the invertebrate world, may be a keystone species. And if they're not, they're clearly an important species. And we know that based on what we know about other predators and ecosystems, right? So sea otters are one, but coyotes are an interesting example because they're now the largest mammalian predator in a lot of ecosystems. And we know from some of the experiments in places like Texas that if you reduce the number of coyotes, you have this huge impact on small mammal populations, and you can reduce the diversity of mice and other small mammals. And then that has a rippling effect and then changes the availability of food for other animals. It changes the way the grassland vegetation is managed by those mammals, just because of a diminishing number of coyotes, not even getting rid of the coyotes, just having fewer of them. So just keystone species, like Sarah said, can be hard to define, but I think one of the key points is that it does have that, like you said, like this cascading ripple effect through the ecosystem. So many other things change the way they act or survive based on how that species is doing and what it's doing.
It's interesting that you talk about there's a lot that we still don't know, because one of our questions was, you mentioned a lot of mammals. Are they mostly just mammals? But you mentioned invertebrates, you mentioned spiders. Like, are there amphibians or reptiles, or are there bird keystone species? And there might be, we just don't know yet. So, yeah.
I think mammals are just so much more charismatic in a lot of instances, and so people study those populations a lot more, and that's why we have a lot of information on mammals and their effects on communities and ecosystems rather than insects or plants, for instance.
They're sexy.
They are
we
sexy,
get it.
and also, you know what? We're mammals, so
we're
a little biased.
Yeah, we like to
when
study
we
what
talk
we
about
know.
things. Let's
Yeah.
just be, if we were walking around and being spiders right now, like maybe we'd pay more attention. And that's really good. Also, it sounds like to our participants, if you're confused on a keystone species, it's okay, because it sounds like most of ecology is too. So we'll just chat about it tonight, and I guess define it, within our program. But that's really good. I think that's a good way to start.
Yeah.
What about, this one?
Yeah, so a lot of the keystone species that we're talking about tonight, like prairie dogs, bison, beavers, we also sometimes call them ecological engineers. So animals that somehow like alter their environment to basically fit their needs. And then is that the same as the keystone species, or are there differences between them? Can you kind of talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah or Chris. You guys want to jump in?
They're so excited to nerd out. Awesome.
Well, so ecosystem engineers are species that essentially modify their environment, right? And once they modify their environment through some way, like could be through herbivory or burrowing or something like that, that would shape the species that are there, or the abundances of species that are there. And so the effect on the ecosystem they're having is by their behavior of modifying that physical area around there. And the effects of ecosystem engineers are often long-lasting, more long-lasting sometimes than keystone species. And that's one of the critical definitions to separate those two groups. Now, you can be a keystone species and an ecosystem engineer, right? But there are some species that are just, either or, based upon whatever loose definition we want to give it.
Okay.
Interesting.
Okay.
And as I was preparing, doing a little bit of my prairie dog research, I actually came across a paper that described prairie dogs as keystone engineers.
Really?
So they just combine
Both of the words together. Yeah.
Wow.
In that they're keystone species, they have a really great effect on an ecosystem, but they also create or destroy or modify habitat too. So they're creating their own habitat as a keystone engineer.
That's cool. That's really good.
I mean, this could be a time where I could show a couple of those pictures that I was telling you about earlier, if that would help. Because I can talk about bison as an engineer real fast if you want.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's go there.
Okay. So one of the fun things about bison is that they sometimes flip over and roll around on the ground. And there's various reasons they do that. They're dusting themselves for insects, or they're leaving scents, or other things. But as a result of that, they often then create these wallow areas, which is a new feature on the landscape, right? It's kind of a shallow depression. Sometimes they can be really big, sometimes they're really small, but they provide a habitat that wasn't there before the bison were there. There's bare ground. Sometimes if they're low in the landscape and you get a lot of rain, or if groundwater comes up, they can actually form little wetlands that weren't there before. So Adam's going to talk about how beavers make wetlands, and that's true, but bison can too.
Sweet. Amazing.
I want to see Sarah make the case for prairie dogs on wetlands. And then one of the other things that it's kind of a combination of fire and bison grazing is probably the most powerful force there is in terms of habitat creation in grasslands, I would argue. And one thing that's really important about this that I don't want to skip over is that another mammal is a big piece of this, which is humans, right? So most of the fires in prairies, both historically and now, are human-caused fires. And the prairies that we have in Nebraska now are between 8,000 and 10,000 years old or so. During that entire time, people have been managing prairies with fire. And for a lot of our prairies, they became prairies because of human use of fire. So that's important. And the reason it's important is it makes it an interesting conversation when you try to think about what's natural and what's not, because people tend to remove humans from something to say that it's natural. And I would say with grasslands, it's really difficult to do that because grasslands are built on this interaction between humans and the ecosystem. But what happens is when there's a fire, you get this nice lush regrowth of grass, and that attracts bison. And when they come in large numbers, they have an incredible impact on the landscape, to the point where they can create these large areas of a lot of bare ground, very short grass. And that's a habitat type that's really important for some animals. There are bird species that need to nest in really short habitat like that. Things like grasshoppers and other insects really thrive in that environment, which draws in all the other things that eat insects in big numbers. So it's an important habitat type versus areas where bison are not spending time because there hasn't been a recent fire, where you get this nice, taller, lusher vegetation, which is also important habitat, right? So now you can have both. And then the last piece that comes in there is after the bison are done grazing and when they move off, the prairie goes through this recovery stage where you get kind of this weedy, messy party of growth going on with wildflowers and things, which is really good for pollinators, but it also creates yet another habitat type that is easy to move around through on the surface because there's not a lot of dense grass, but there's overhead cover, both for protection from sunlight and heat, but also protection from predators. And so you can get these incredible fields of sunflowers or these big, congregations of things like 4-point Indian primrose that are both pretty and helpful for pollinators. But again, if you look at the habitat structure there, if you were a tiny little animal, you could run around very easily underneath this sort of forest of plants. So bison kind of create all of this in combination with fire, which again is in combination with people, and as a system, that's a really important, maybe a keystone process in grasslands.
That's cool.
That is really cool.
I love that you had visual aids. I mean, you're a photographer, so that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that.
We do. We're visual
Yeah.
people.
So we were gonna move into that question of each one specifically, and you're just starting us off with bison, Chris. So to understand that correctly, you would say that not only are they a keystone species, but they are ecological engineers, and they do so through their wallows, but also herbivory, like you mentioned. And even would you also say like their movement? They're such heavy animals. They're like hoof impact across the land. Would that be?
I think that's true. And they can create kind of disturbed areas where they make open soil and sometimes erosion, but not necessarily bad erosion because of the trailing that they do or the hoof impacts. I mean, another thing, because I've talked about a lot of the others already, another thing that bison are important for is moving seeds, right? So they've got these big shaggy coats, and then they pick up seeds in the coat that stick to the hair, and then especially as we're coming into summer, they're shedding a lot of that hair. The seeds come off as the hair comes off, but it also comes off when they're rubbing on the ground, they're rolling around and dropping seeds. So there's a lot of research and just a lot of experience showing us how many different species of plants can hitch a ride on a bison and move around the landscape in a way that helps plants disperse. So that's another service that is provided by by bison, in addition to the habitat structure and things that we already talked about.
This is a kind of odd one, but I don't know if you could speak to this. I remember in grad school, I was writing a paper on bison and their ecosystem services. And I remember there was a really cool study, I think in Kansas, that showed that even when they die and their body decomposes in the landscape, it's so much nutrients and carbon being absorbed into that area that there actually creates this like little micro ecosystem where like interesting forbs and other plants are able to like, it's like you see like these beautiful wildflowers instead of a carcass a year or two later even. So I don't know, is that
that's really interesting. I don't know
biomass
about it, but I will say the other thing that happens, of course, is when they die, all kinds of things get to eat.
That's
right?
true.
I mean, it's an incredible food source for not only scavengers, like, you might think of like vultures or coyotes or things like that, and crows, but also, I mean, invertebrates, burying beetles, all kinds of beetles that are scavengers, and all kinds of bacteria and fungi and all these other things too, right? That are outside of the animal kingdom, get this incredible bounty all in one place. So yeah, they can be important even in death, I guess. The last thing I would say is just manure and urine.
Yeah.
Get these sort of infusions of these high fertility, high nitrogen, especially kind of fertilizer drops all over the prairie. And it both recycles some of the nutrients that they pull out as they graze. They're taking nutrients out, but then they put them back manure and urine. And then every time that happens, that has an impact on the plant community, where you get that little flush of some certain kind of plants, and as the nitrogen is processed, then those other things smooth back out and go back to normal again.
So even nutrient cycling.
Yeah. And you know what? I've never literally heard anyone say they don't like bison. Have you ever met someone that's like, I just don't like bison? But like two of our, ecological engineers, superheroes tonight, beavers and prairie dogs, they sometimes get a bad reputation. So Sarah, kind of talk to us a little bit about, like, I know prairie dogs get a bad rap, but like, what do they do that's so special, and what ecosystem services do they provide or impact their environment?
How are they a Keystone engineer that you
Ooh,
introduced
yes.
tonight? That's pretty sweet.
Yes, the Keystone
Or
Engineer.
a superhero is what we're going to call them, but yeah.
Yeah, I like the term superhero too. So prairie dogs can definitely get a bad rap, especially in, their native areas where they tend to be in grassland areas, because they can be quite prolific. Prairie dogs have a lot of young. Their prairie dog towns can continue to grow, and they can kind of take over areas. Granted, that is kind of what they're supposed to do. That is how it has been for so long. But they can kind of get a bad rap because ranchers or farmers or other landowners oftentimes don't want them on their property digging holes and eating their grass. But prairie dogs are really quite amazing in what they can do in grassland ecosystems. They create their own ecosystem, really, by going into an area. They dig holes so that they can live underground in these holes. And by doing that, they actually kind of mix up soil. They affect the animals and the species above ground. They affect animals and species and things like fungus and bacteria below ground. And because they're also clipping vegetation, they're eating grass, they're clipping vegetation, they're affecting the plant communities as well. So I think kind of the three big things of like, why are they these awesome superheroes, is that over 150 species have been documented living in or utilizing prairie dog towns.
Wow.
They are either living in the burrows that prairie dogs create, like salamanders will live in these burrows, spiders, burrowing owls that can't fully dig a burrow themselves will live in prairie dog holes. And probably my favorite is the black-footed ferret, is an endangered species. And without prairie dogs, we do not have black-footed ferrets. These ferrets only eat black-tailed prairie dog. They might eat a little bit of other things here, maybe a few other things here, but it's almost exclusive. Like 90% of their diet is prairie dog.
Wow.
Do prairie dogs make holes? Not only are they moving the soil around, animals are living in those burrows, but things are also eating the prairie dogs. There's so many up there that black-footed ferrets can eat prairie dogs, badgers, coyotes, rattlesnakes, ferruginous hawks, swift foxes. Probably my favorite species of all is the swift fox. They'll eat prairie dogs. And so for the fact that they're creating this ecosystem, they're making a home for a lot of species, and they're also, frankly, a food source for a lot of species as well.
Mhm.
The last thing I kind of wanted to hit on was that research has actually shown that cattle and bison prefer to graze in some prairie dog towns because the forb density is different than in other parts of grasslands. So because there are so many prairie dogs up there chewing on the grass, eating the forbs, which are like flowering plants, it can actually change the density of the forbs or the flowering plants in that area. And oftentimes cattle or bison or other grazers will come to that area because of that different density of flowering plants.
Is the different density like tastier or something? Is there more nutrients there? It sounds
Well,
like
so I did read,
themselves.
yeah, I read one study that was claiming that there was more nutrition in the plants coming off of a prairie dog town. I didn't read the entire study, but it was published and it was cited. So maybe that is true. I don't know, maybe even Chris can speak to that. It seems like he can, but I have heard that that is true. Chris, can you vouch for that?
Yeah, no, there is I mean, it's similar really to a fire in that when you cause grasses to flush and grow this new burst of growth, that is often more nutritious. It's got more protein in it. So it is really attractive to those large grazers. Now, the flip side of that is there's less to eat there because the like you said earlier, the prairie dogs are eating a lot of that vegetation. So it's sort of this trade-off of there's less food, but it's higher quality food.
Yeah.
And it definitely is very attractive to those large grazers. So
Wow.
I'm sure my bison are very appreciative of Sarah's prairie dogs being on the landscape.
I like that.
And I mean, personally, being someone that loves rattlesnakes and goes looking for rattlesnakes, I'm always excited when I see prairie dog tunnels and holes because that's where I find a rattlesnake. So thank you, prairie dog.
And a bird nerd here, I can vouch seeing a burrowing owl.
Yeah.
Out of a prairie dog colony. It was the coolest
adorable,
thing ever.
yeah.
Also, Virginia's hawk. I gotta do a shout out. Pretty sweet.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Anything else, Sarah, that you want to shout out to prairie dogs on that?
I mean, I could go on. There's one
Okay.
cool thing I could share. It's not related to how they're ecological superheroes necessarily, but it's just like the coolest thing about prairie dogs that I feel like I have to share is that they have the most developed language
Yes, I was gonna ask this.
animal, second only to humans.
So cool.
Oftentimes you might think that like dolphins, can really communicate or they're very smart, or even chimpanzees are very smart and they can communicate. But it has actually been recorded that prairie dogs actually have the most well-developed language. That not only do they have different chirps and barks and calls for different animals, but they can differentiate between like a coyote and a domestic dog.
In communicating?
By like chirping and barking.
Are you serious?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Do you think there's like a prairie dog linguist out there somewhere where we can nerd out with? Because
Oh yeah, he's in Arizona.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Good to
Let's
know.
get the name. That's pretty amazing. Oh, so
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Just so cool. They can differentiate between color too. This will be the last thing I throw out there is they actually had people walk through a prairie dog colony, the same person, but wearing different colored shirts. And the calls that the prairie dogs were making were human, but describing the fact that they had a different colored shirt on.
No way.
Wow.
So I had to just
way more
throw that
sense.
in there because we're talking prairie dogs. I have to add that little tasty bit. But
You know that we're talking
Superheroes.
about ecological superheroes, and you're just defining the character for us tonight.
Yes.
So there's some cool characteristics. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But we want to make sure we also hear about one more ecological
Yeah.
superhero.
Another sometimes animal that gets a bad reputation or a lot of people see as a nuisance. But Adam, please tell us all the cool things, amazing things that beavers do for us.
Well, they don't have the communication capability that prairie dogs do. So,
But don't they slap the water though?
No,
Like they,
well, yeah, no, they do have a lot of cool ways to communicate, but
Yeah.
but nothing like what Sarah is talking about. Beavers are one of those species that you can really see the effects of their behavior on the ecosystem right away, right? So in areas where there weren't wetlands, there are now wetlands. So beavers have this behavior where they generally move to moving water or rushing water, or areas where water is just moving along and not contained, and they just habitually build dams, right? And so a lot of that is for a number of reasons, but one of them is to create this more, not ephemeral habitat, but a more permanent habitat where they can build dens, where they can have kits, and where they can actually store food for the winter, especially in northern areas where they get a lot of ice and they can store food under that ice and eat it throughout the winter.
Wow.
Their effects are huge. There's actually, you can look and see their beaver dams in space through satellites. There's actually the largest beaver dam in the world that we know of right now is in Alberta, and it's about a half a mile long, and you can actually see it from a satellite in space.
Okay.
And so, yeah, just Google, largest beaver dam or something. But so, in areas where there weren't wetlands, now we have wetlands. And so where we didn't have bluegills or otters or catfish or amphibians, these beavers create areas where these species and these communities can now thrive, right? And because of that, the plant structure changes also. And so beavers have this really outsized role for their body size on the entire ecosystem. So a single beaver or a colony of beavers can build a dam that will cover hundreds of acres, right, and change that area into now a functioning wetland ecosystem, which has all sorts of benefits for carbon storage, which is an effect that's scaling up to our planet Earth, right? So they're kind of the poster child for species that can really change their ecosystem, and in a way that's visible to everybody and almost indisputable to everybody. But beavers are also prey, right? And so I do a lot of work in Voyageurs National Park up in northern Minnesota. And they have the highest wolf densities in that area in North America, in northern Minnesota. And the wolf packs up there are focusing on beaver populations, right? They're not spending a lot of time chasing deer or chasing moose or other things, but they're spending most of their times hunting beavers, right? And that's what sustains those populations and brings those wolf populations up to the numbers that they are right now. As far as impacts of beavers to humans, there's a lot of negative aspects. We always hear of the negative things that beavers are doing. For instance, burrowing in the side of dams, right, which is a huge one. And I would argue that if there's any human wildlife conflict people on here, a lot of the calls they get are probably beavers, especially around the Platte River, Elkhorn River, or Loop River area, for those calls to remove beavers from the property. But beaver caster is one of those communication tools that beavers have that they'll place along the landscape. It's a gland on their back end, and it secretes this liquid, and so they can communicate with different beavers in the area. Humans actually use beaver caster for a number of things. For perfumes, they actually make vanilla, the vanilla extract that we eat. Some of that comes from beaver caster. So humans use beavers for a number of different reasons. They're a big part of the fur trade. They were a huge part of the fur trade in the early 18th century. There's a whole book called Fur, Fortune, and Empire. It's a really good book if you haven't read it. It essentially talks about the reason that Europeans colonized North America was because of the beaver abundances in Canada and in the United States. So yeah, they're one of those species that really have an outsized effect on their ecosystem and creates brand new ecosystems in areas where there weren't wetlands before.
That's interesting. I have a question for you specifically about beavers, and also Chris Meltzer has one too that I want to make sure that we ask. He's with us tonight. Chris, you can also ask that if you want. But however, I just want to understand, because I feel like a lot of people they just wonder like why beavers build dams, and it's cool to learn that they build them, or you can speak to it, but they build them so that, well, why don't you answer this?
Yeah, so beavers are semi-aquatic mammals, right? And so the places where they have their young, or they care for their young, are either in bank burrows. So they'll dig into bank burrows and create this big cavity in the bank where they have their young, where they spend a lot of their winter. But the openings of those burrows are underwater, right? And so they do that to avoid a lot of predators that might get into those areas. Or another way they build shelters is through a beaver lodge, right? This great big wooden structure they build up with willow sticks or cottonwood sticks, especially in the Nebraska area. And they'll have a cavity within that they'll have young, but the openings to the lodges is underwater. Okay.
Because I think a lot of people think like the dams themselves are where their houses are, but the dams, right? That's the difference. Okay.
Yeah, no, the dams themselves are actually dams, right? They don't live in the dams. They live in a different shelter altogether. And they're pretty conspicuous if they're the large wooden lodges. A lot of times we see those in Voyageurs National Park, and you'll see them all over Nebraska also. And I think Mike Forsberg, like Chris was talking about before, has a whole photo series on beaver dams and uses for different mammals and different species. But they also do bank burrows. So if there's like a hillside where the water is adjacent to it, they'll dig an opening underwater and then have a huge cavity where they have kits and they have colonies. that support other things like muskrat populations and support amphibians and turtles and all sorts of crazy things. And so they dam water up to create large water level areas where they can actually have these houses, but also so they can store food for the winter. So in areas where there's a lot of ice up, like in northern Minnesota or North Dakota, or even in northern parts of Nebraska, they can bring willow sticks and things down under the water and have a cache of food, like a big refrigerator that they can access any time of the year. And they can't do that in places like rivers or streams because they freeze up or they're just not very hydrologically stable.
So my question is, I've always been curious about this. Do beavers, is this a learned behavior to create a dam, or is it just genetic drive? Like I see these really funny memes. Do you ever see them? And it's like flowing water and a beaver says, no, not today, not today. So is it just like that? It's just this drive, they hear flowing water, they have to make a dam, or is it something that they learned from their parents? I don't know if you can speak to that. That's more of like a nerdy behavior.
No, I don't think, I've never seen a study that actually that looks directly at if it's a learned or innate behavior. My guess is it's an innate behavior that's maybe learned a little bit from parents also, but there's definitely just a big urge to dam anything up that's moving.
It's just a big urge. It's just what they gotta do when they wake up. They gotta do things.
Yeah.
And Chris's question, it was a good one, is do you know if that wolf predation up in that part of Minnesota changes the behaviors of beavers, similar to like wolf predation changing behaviors of elk in Yellowstone?
No, I don't know if that's, I know that wolf predation, I know the behavior aspects from the wolf populations themselves, but not on the beaver population. I don't know the individual beaver behavior associated with it. Wolves have actually been found to actually ambush beavers up there. And so some wolves are better at catching beavers than others. And so those individuals will hide in ambush and wait for beavers, especially in the wintertime when they can get to those areas. And their beavers are just, essentially giant Triscuits in the North Woods, right? So these wolves essentially find them when they're full of fat, they're full of energy, and they do wonders up there. And so I don't know about if beavers learn about that or not. I'm not for sure if they live long enough to actually learn that type of behavior, but wolves have definitely keyed in on beavers and what they do and find areas where they travel and will ambush them.
That's cool.
That's cool.
Yeah, go for it, Chris.
I was just, so I didn't expect to hear beavers compared to Triscuits tonight.
I know.
That's pretty wonderful. B, Adam, since you mentioned river otters earlier, one of the things that I remember about beavers and lodges along the Platte River especially is that when we started, we meaning other people, studying river otters and how they were using the Platte River, they found out that they were using beaver lodges as overnight roosts or overnight stays, right? So they basically would travel up and down the river, and they would, an otter might stay in a different beaver lodge every night as they're moving around the landscape.
Just like river Airbnb for river otters.
Exactly. And then Eric Fowler, since we're talking about photographers, Eric Fowler was sitting up on a beaver lodge because they had a radio transmitter on an otter and knew the otter was inside. And so he waited for this otter to come out. And instead what he had was a beaver came out, and another beaver came out, and another beaver came out. Eventually the otter came out too. And so apparently they share space.
Wow.
And like, not only are the other otters using the beaver lodges, but apparently the beavers are okay with it, or at least
Totally fine.
So it's not an
They are
Airbnb,
really-
it's a bed and breakfast. It's a beaver bed and breakfast, and they're welcoming hosts.
Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
just to add a little bit to that too, one of the studies that we're doing in Voyageurs National Park is tracking survival of muskrats, which are small semi-aquatic mammals also. And we catch these muskrats, and then we surgically implant transmitters into their abdomen and follow them around and see what affects survival. And we found that muskrats that actually use beaver lodges and stay in beaver lodges have a way increased survival than those that do not. So simply because in areas where muskrats build little grass huts, and it's a really frigid environment up there, and in areas where they can find a stable place to get away from predators and get out of the water, they have higher survival than those that don't. And so beavers have that outsized impact again on ecosystems where they're affecting survival of other conspecifics. And muskrats use beaver lodges all the time. We did something in Illinois one time where we put cameras in beaver lodges and watched like what happens in beaver lodges, and you'll see otters go in there and muskrat kits, and they'll play around, and they seem to just be sympatric and hang out with each other, and they're not really aggressive for the most part.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like add it to the list of ecological superheroes for beavers. They're incredible hosts. Yeah. And hostesses.
We
I like
saw
it a lot.
we saw a beaver not that long ago up in Ponca when we were doing a workshop up there, and it was the cutest little like chubber of a like beaver walking up and down, eating the willow saplings and walking them down to the, oh gosh, it was the coolest thing. We watched it for like half an hour.
So add also they're adorable.
Yeah,
Which
and
all of them are.
let me tell
so
you,
far.
damn, that was interesting.
That
So,
was-
I had to add that in. All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, that was good. Okay, so we heard about each one that we want to speak to tonight, and so now we're kind of moving into like the how and the process of the science behind understanding this. So we want to know, and maybe we spoke to it a little bit in the definition, but how would you, as ecologists, biologists, and scientists, say like, how would you determine if something is a keystone species? What has that process always looked the same? Is it a changing process?
Like, how did the first person know I'm going to call this a keystone species, and like, how did they like come to that conclusion? You might not have that answer, but a good theory would be good too.
Mhm.
Well, I don't want to hog this conversation, but so the first person that came up with a theory of keystone species was, I can't think of his first name, it was Payne was his last name.
I love that.
And essentially he was working in marine ecosystems, and there was a sea star. I'm not a marine biologist, so I really don't know the technical names. Okra sea star. He essentially experimentally removed all those from the ecosystem and then watched how the whole thing changed. And so essentially based on that, he coined the term keystone species.
Oh, Robert
T. Payne.
Okay.
Yep.
It's like a rapper.
So,
I know that's all I got.
That's really cool.
That is really
Okay.
cool. Yeah.
So,
and then
so he's showing, so maybe through that definition, he was showing like, again, just that cascading effect of the environment and also species that were living in that environment. And so, and you keep mentioning, I like how you keep mentioning for their size, they have this outsized impact on the environment.
yes.
And so maybe it's just that, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, think of what a keystone actually is, right? A keystone is that stone and stone archways at the very top that holds it all together, right? And they're small, right? And you can kind of see them up there. But if you pulled that keystone out of there, the whole thing would collapse. And that's kind of where the term keystone species comes from. And so if you think about species that have a really outsized effect on our ecosystem, it's similar to a keystone. If you pull that out of a stone arch, the whole thing collapses.
So
That's
if you
cool.
were to lose a keystone species, like, goodness gracious, let's not have this happen, but all the prairie dogs, all the beavers, I know, or bison, were gone. Will another species come in to take their position
In that niche.
or is that something that happens over millions of years, and the ecosystem would have to change to have a new keystone species come
Good
up and
question.
take their position?
Like big shoes to fill. How does that happen if one is removed?
I mean, one example of that would be the coyotes, right? The coyotes are more important maybe now than they were when we had more larger predators around, because now we don't have those larger predators. Coyotes are playing some of the roles that things like a wolf, might have played in a place like Nebraska. And that was a pretty quick transition. And but it's tricky because I don't know that you could argue that they play the exact same role, right? They're not affecting all the same species in the same way. It's different, but their role has changed pretty quickly, and maybe they've stepped in and covered some of the things that a population of wolves might have done. So that's a partial answer, I guess.
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting.
And
I
we
can
might
see
not
that.
know because, again, goodness gracious, let's not have all the bison or prairie dogs or beavers leave, and we wouldn't be around to see probably how that correlates.
I'm not sure what would substitute for a beaver. That would be
But
mean,
Tristan,
with bison, of
Well-
course, cattle now play a lot of the same roles as bison a lot across the landscape and do many of the same things very effectively, actually. And as land managers, we use cattle all the time to manage for the same kinds of habitat structure that bison would provide.
Okay.
But that's pretty different because that's a managed species, very carefully managed by people. But
Right.
so it's not like cattle are doing it on their own, stepping in.
Right.
But anyway, that's
Interesting.
something similar.
Yeah, Adam, what do you think? What would could something replace beavers? Probably. That's so unique.
No, and if we think back to the Pleistocene, we actually had beavers that were about the size of black bears running around prairies.
Go back.
And so essentially we lost that species, and we're okay. But people understand the really critical role that beavers have, and humans are actually building beaver analog ponds across areas where there aren't beavers, or where they don't want beavers to have these really negative human interactions. they essentially build these ponds now that act as beaver wetlands. And I think in the Kansas City area, they're building a lot around there now in eastern Kansas, trying to replicate the effects that beavers have on ecosystems that way. But again, it's just kind of a, I don't know, not a very natural way of doing things, I guess.
So like we could let them do their job for free, or we remove them and we have to pay for these services, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's true. But beavers do cause, in areas, where there is a lot of infrastructure, they cause, millions and millions and millions of dollars of damage. And so in a perfect world, you're right. But I'm a realist, and we're never going to get to a point where we're living, everybody essentially is living in Southern Ontario where it's open and there's beaver dams everywhere. That's just not going to happen. And so we have to find a way to coexist with beavers, and just acknowledge the fact that they are going to do a lot of damage in areas where they shouldn't be anymore.
There was a, in town here, we have a Home Depot kind of outside on Highway 2, and there was a big, large kind of pond that was back there. And this beaver had moved in and built its little lodge area. And every time it rained really hard, that would flood into the Home Depot. And I remember like every time I'm like, I just was interested. I'm like, I want to see the beaver, and if you go by, you might be able to see it. And I remember one day I went by and there were people, actively, humanely removing the beaver because it was causing so much damage to that Home Depot every time it would flood and all the stuff would get wet. So I don't know, very interesting, I think. So yeah. So kind of speaking about that, we only have about 13 minutes and I want to make sure that we get time for our lightning round here. So talking a little bit about, we did talk a little bit about how our species provide services to other animals in the ecosystem. And Adam, you kind of touched on how they provide services a little to people. How do our keystone species provide services to people? And, like a lot of people, if they come up to us as educators, why should they care about prairie dogs? Why should they care about beavers? Why should they care about bison? How is it going to literally affect them? Could you speak on that, Chris and Adam and Sarah?
Yeah, I'm really glad you guys asked this question. I think it's a really common one, especially when it comes to prairie dogs. Why are they even good? Why should I even keep them on my property? And just last week, I was out in North Platte, Nebraska, doing some wildlife surveys. And as I was driving around, we passed every so often a beautiful prairie dog town. There would just be so many prairie dogs. There were birds flying over, you could tell that they were kind of congregating into this area. And I had commented to the other biologist I was with, like, wow, look at that prairie dog town. Like, that's so cool. I'm so glad to see it. And he said that the man that owns a lot of the land where those prairie dogs are, he actually keeps them there so he can hunt them. But in a way that almost seems kind of counterintuitive. But I'm actually really glad that prairie dogs are at least on the landscape there. Doing some recreational shooting or some recreational hunting of prairie dogs is probably not going to destroy that population, especially if that guy is actively trying to continue to keep shooting. So you can have a recreational component to it, but you are then having this whole ecosystem developed right there on your property. You have the prairie dogs, you are, improving some of the protein density, like Chris said, for your cattle. You have all these different invertebrates and birds and other mammals that are able to congregate in this area and benefit off this species. And even if it's because he can hunt them, I don't mind that. The prairie dogs are there, and it's better than having a cornfield right there. So they can be recreational. Some people just think they're cute. I think the fact that they can talk to each other is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
The recreational component is actually really big when it comes to prairie dogs.
Huh. That's good. I never really thought of it like that because, you get that bad light about people wanting them off their property. But like you said, they're there and it's better than the alternative, which is a cornfield. So that's good. Thank you, Sarah. Chris or Adam, do you want to talk about human services from bison or beavers?
I mean, bison is pretty easy, especially when you think about indigenous cultures and the immense cultural significance of bison to the Plains tribes, both historically and today. And especially pre-colonization, it probably, I don't know how you would argue it wasn't the most important animal on the landscape to people, right? Because of the food source, but all the other things that came along with it, and the fact that they were an engineer that affected the ecosystem, which affected the people. And then, both bison and their analog today, which are cattle, are still doing all those services that keep prairies healthy and providing the ecosystem services that, other animals and plants need, but that also people benefit from.
Mhm.
So they're a food source for us today as well. And again, even if you substitute cattle for them, the cattle are the food source, but
Mhm.
we raise a lot of food out of our grasslands from those large grazers.
That's true. That's good. Yeah, very good.
And
Anna?
of course, they're cool, and they're just,
Super cool.
and you said earlier that how important they are as a grassland, sort of a poster child of grassland. They're incredible ambassadors to get people to care about prairies. I mean, if I was gonna, there are a lot of ways I can get people to care about prairies, but the easiest way is to
Mhm.
throw them in a pickup and drive them out into the middle of one of our pastures, for example, at the Niobrara Valley Preserve, and sit in the middle of a herd of 500 bison in a 10,000 acre pasture in the 12 million acre grassland landscape. People just we're trying to figure out how do we provide that for more people, because we really do need to, because it's impossible not to fall in love with prairies after you have that experience. So
I was going to
as
ask you,
an
Chris.
ambassador, that's amazingly important. Sorry.
Yeah, and I really like that, but and I was going to ask you briefly, where can you go to see bison in Nebraska? I know that's maybe a little more tricky with prairie dogs and beavers. Maybe we know where to go, but
Home
for Home Depot. But yeah, bison, where do you go in Nebraska to find them? Where are the herds, I guess?
There's smaller herds I think Pioneers Park still has some bison, right, in Lincoln.
Mhm.
The Crane Trust has bison out along the Platte River, west of Grand Island. You can go to Fort Niobrara up along the Niobrara and the northern sandhills. Nature Conservancy Niobrara Valley Preserve, we have bison. They can be hard to see because we're not currently set up to make it easy for you. They're in these 10 to 12,000 acre pastures, and so if they happen to be along the road when you drive by, great.
Mhm.
But it's not a herd set up for public access. But those are some of the places where it's easy. And then beyond Nebraska, places like Custer State Park.
Mhm.
Is it Custer State Park? Yeah. That's a classic place to go see them, and prairie dogs in a large landscape where they're pretty accessible to people.
I want to say there's a place in western Nebraska too, at like Fort Robinson may have some. I think last year when I was out there, I think maybe not. Never mind. Yeah, yep.
I don't
Anyway,
think
those
Fort
places.
Rock does. The last one I was gonna say was Badlands National Park
Oh yeah.
in the Black Hills, but Badlands National Park, you'll get beaver, or you'll get bison and prairie dog together.
Very cool.
Sweet. That's good.
Adam, do you want to talk a little bit briefly about how beavers benefit people and the services that they provide for us?
Well, yeah, briefly, like I mentioned, beaver castor, furs, providing habitats for other species that are important for humans. But I think Chris hit it on the head there. There's these intrinsic values of just them being on the landscape. Aldo Leopold said something along the lines of that. If you remove a grouse from like the tamarack forest, all the tamaracks are there, the whole ecosystem's there, but if the grouse is gone, the whole place is dead, right? Because that one species is gone. And I'm a wetland biologist. I work with semi-aquatic mammal species. And if I went up to Voyageurs National Park or the Boundary Waters, the water could be there, the trees could be there, the loons could be there, but if the beavers were gone, it'd be dead. And so just that intrinsic value of still having them on the landscape is really, really important. And I don't think we harp on that enough as ecologists and conservationists.
That's
I love
awesome.
that.
I got goosebumps when you kept
Me
saying
too.
that.
Yeah.
So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, I really like I like that point you just made, because like as scientists, you're involved in the research and you're involved in the analysis, but if you are speaking to your values of like what you're excited and passionate about, what brings you into the field, I think it's so cool for people to hear that and connect with that. So thanks for sharing with that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Are you ready for our lightning round?
Yeah.
We have
so-
5 minutes and we have amazing questions and I want to get to them.
We had one from an unknown nerd here. She didn't want to make herself known, but we have one from the audience. Someone she wanted to ask, and Chris, you might be the best one to do this. Are pollinators themselves as a group of living species considered keystone, or we read about keystone mutualists? So, interacting with the environment, and if two of those things go, then they go. But what about pollinators?
we were nerding out trying
Someone
to
was really wanting to
coming
know.
up with the questions for
So.
tonight, and we're like, what makes a keystone species? And that was the thing, because pollinators, if you remove them, like everything collapses really. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue against that, right? And
Yeah.
And I guess I would say that out of the pollinators, the bees probably would be the
Okay.
keystone, just because bees are the more efficient, the most efficient group of pollinators for most plant species. Now there's other things that bees don't do a great job of. And when I say bees, I'm talking about the 4,000 species of bees across the country, right? Not honeybees, which are much less important ecologically than all the other ones. But yeah, I think, you know, if you don't have flowers producing fruits and producing seeds, that removes an incredible food source for a lot of animals, and it changes the reproductive ability of plants, and everybody relies on plants. So
That's
yeah,
good.
absolutely. Pollinators are right up there.
Yeah, when we were asking this question to ourselves, Monica found a cool a definition of, what did you say, keystone mutualist,
Mutualist,
which is like a group of animals that serves as that. So that's kind of something, maybe another nature nerd night. Yeah, something to dive into. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What's another good
We
one?
did not hit on birds tonight. I
Oh,
want to
yeah.
know if there's someone had asked, are there bird keystone species that we know of?
If you don't know, that's okay, but it was a good question from
Yeah.
the crowd. Bird keystone species.
See, birds are not everything.
You know
They are
what?
not keystone species.
You know what? You don't know that.
Man, birds are fine.
Yeah, I'm stumping them.
Sure there is. I just can't think of anything right off the top of my
Okay.
head. Mammologist.
No, that's good to know.
Don't
So.
tell Lurkin I said that.
You stumped
Probably-
the nerds.
Yeah.
What do you say,
Maybe
Chris?
we'll have to do some Googling and we'll find.
We will, and also we'll look a little bit tonight too, and we'll
Yeah.
make sure to put that in our email tomorrow.
Yes,
Because if we
we
find
can.
something,
Mhm.
so I don't want to raptors. Donna says raptors as a species. I mean vultures, you know.
That's what I was going to say. I mean,
Vultures.
predatory birds certainly have
Yeah.
a big impact on things. I'm not sure that rises to the level of a keystone species or a keystone.
But again, like that important species that you mentioned earlier, important than keystone. So someone had asked also, what is the overall status of keystone species at this time? Are the conditions for a healthy balance improving?
Well, the problem with that question, I mean, it's a good question, but
Yeah.
as Sarah mentioned before, that, you know, the definition of a keystone species is kind of loosey-goosey in a lot of different areas. And so anybody that is an ecologist or a biologist that works on a species, like I work on muskrats, we just say, hey, they're a keystone species because they do really cool things. And so any species on Earth, you could probably make an argument that they're a keystone species in some way. And so I don't know, that'd be hard to do based on the definition of a keystone species.
I wonder if it's our definition is in going to change on keystone species as we move into this science where we're understanding how everything is really more connected than we thought. You know, in the last 50 years, there's so much more research, you know, highlighting the connection and the symbiosis between way more species than we know about. So I just wonder if it's like that definition is going to change. I don't know. Just
Well,
I will say that for prairie dogs as a whole, there's actually, I believe, 4 species of prairie dogs in North America. We're at only about 10% of the population than it used to be, like pre-European colonization. So for that specific group of prairie dogs as keystone species, really not looking good compared to, you know, 200, 500 years ago.
yeah.
That's
So
crazy.
maybe to provide a little bit more optimistic view of both something Adam said and what Sarah just said, both of which were right. I think one of the things we've seen as we've seen habitat fragmentation and habitat loss is that there are still small sites who have lost some of those keystone species that still have an incredible diversity of plants and animals. And there's this incredible resilience, even in small sites, that has been surprising. Like there are very few species that have become extinct in tallgrass prairie, even though we've lost the vast majority of our tallgrass prairie. There's just not that much that have actually gone extinct. And it doesn't mean they won't. And there's serious issues that we're facing, but they've been really resilient so far. And I think part of that is that because even though the keystone species have left, we have other things that have stepped in, and there's just been all these other complex interactions that have allowed things to survive. So I take a lot of hope for that. I'm pretty optimistic,
Good.
actually.
I like
That's
that.
good to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to
Yeah.
end on a hopeful note
Yeah.
too.
Well, that was awesome.
Yeah,
I
that was
learned
incredible.
a lot, and I hope you audiences as well. I hope that, you know, thank you again, Adam and Chris and Sarah, for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. If you are all interested, we have another Nature Nerd Night coming up. We only have a few left, 3 more for the end of the year. But next one will be Tuesday, September 20th, same time, 7 to 8 p.m. via Zoom. And we're going to be talking WebMD,
Wildlife
dirt
WebMD.
on zoonotic diseases. So we're going to be getting nitty gritty into disease. So
Be
we have
good.
some good people for that one. And then
Our
all
team
of our
members know that they make a difference every
and
day,
then
and so they
all of
really
our
support and lift each other up and know how to.
There we go. Thank you, whoever muted yourself. So next, actually, all of our Lincoln people, if you are interested and you've been following Nature Nerd, we have a Nature Nerd trivia night.
In person.
In person,
Next
not
Tuesday.
Zoom. Yep, at Code Brewing here in Lincoln from 7 to 9 p.m. Like Amber said, it's in person. It is free to attend with a purchase from Code, but we do not need you to register beforehand. Teams of 5 or less are welcome to join. And we have some cool prizes.
So if you have
Nerdy
been
prices.
checking out this Nebraska Nature Nerd Night program for a while, you might be pretty knowledgeable at this point. You should test out your knowledge if you're in
Yeah.
Lincoln. Just it's a challenge I'm putting out there.
We will also provide those details in the evaluation and resources that we send out tomorrow. So we will hopefully do that by about noon tomorrow. So the YouTube channel will have up all the evaluation, all the resources that we talked about tonight. So
which were a lot.
yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah.
So
Thank you all.
And I just put one more resource in the chat. I had to share my favorite song about beavers by the Banana Slug String Band. It's my daughter's favorite song, so it's about to get stuck in your head too.
I'm
all
proud
right.
to be
Thank
a
you.
beaver. Okay, we're gonna write
Oh,
that
someone said Swift foxes are her favorite. So
down. That's pretty
Sarah would
sweet.
love to hear that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you to
Yeah.
our experts tonight for sharing your knowledge and for nerding out with us. It's been really fun.
Yeah, this was good. Thank you all.
All right.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.